Welcome, everyone, to the News Innovation Series from the Shorenstein Center for Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. We're going to wait just a couple of minutes as people come in to the room and join this really important and crucial conversation. My name is Jennifer Preston. I'm a fellow here at the Shorenstein Center. I joined the Shorenstein Center a year ago after 6.5 years at the Knight Foundation, where I ran the journalism program and had the extraordinary opportunity to meet outstanding leaders across the country who are focused on solutions to address the crisis in local journalism. So the problem of local journalism, the crisis around the business model, has been well documented in the research, and it has dominated many conversations in communities around the country, as the traditional business model for journalism is no longer able to support the really robust reporting that we need and the trusted, credible news and information in communities that we need at a time when misinformation and disinformation is just flooding social media platforms and cable television news. So today, I am thrilled to be able to have with us leaders of nonprofit news organizations across the country who are coming up with innovative methods and models to generate the revenue and generate and create a sustainable future for journalism. So joining me today, and I'm just going to go around where I see folks, is Sue Cross, who is the CEO of the Institute for Not-for-Profit News, Mary Walter Brown, who is the founder of the News Revenue Hub, which has helped news outlets across the country focus on generating sustainable revenue opportunities for their news organizations. Lauren Gustus, who is the editor-in-chief of the Salt Lake Tribune. You will hear from Lauren how the Salt Lake Tribune, which is a newspaper that has been around for more than 150 years, is the first major metropolitan daily newspaper across the country to become a not-for-profit, and why that business model made sense for the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm also thrilled that here today we have Lillian Ruiz, who is the COO of the National Trust for Local News, which is taking all sorts of very interesting approaches to make sure both capital and to help make sure that community news organizations, leaders of news organizations committed to their communities, have the resources they need to create a future. Also, we have Michelle Sobranovic from the American Journalism Project, which is a philanthropic venture capital fund, which was launched just a couple of years ago to help make sure that the emerging news organizations across the country have the business and technology expertise that they need and the capital to succeed. And finally, I am thrilled to introduce Tracy Powell, who is my fellow Shorenstein Center fellow here. Tracy and I have worked together and have been friends for a very long time. Tracy is the chairman of the board for Lion Publishers, which represents hundreds of local online publishers across the country. She was the founding managing director of the Borealis Fund, which helped direct resources and funds to news organizations led by people of color across the country. And I have been thrilled to be here with Tracy at the Shorenstein Center as she prepares to launch her most exciting next venture, the Pivot Fund, which is a philanthropic venture capital fund that is focused on supporting journalism in communities of color. And I can't wait for Tracy to tell us about her vision and what is happening next. So first, I'd like to start with Mary Walter Brown. Good morning, Mary. So Mary was the publisher of the Voice of San Diego, which was one of the first not-for-profit news organizations and one of the most successful in the country, not only serving and delivering great journalism, but also putting a great deal of focus and energy and making sure that the Voice of San Diego was a sustainable business operation. Mary was publisher of the Voice of San Diego, and I can't tell you how many people I would send to Mary and say, you have to learn from Mary Walter Brown. Mary Walter Brown has figured it out at the Voice of San Diego. So Mary, tell us why you launched News Revenue Hub and how is a nonprofit news organization focused on generating revenue helping nonprofit news organizations become sustainable?
Well, thank you for that introduction. Thanks for having me. This is obviously my favorite topic. Yeah, I mean, I've learned so much. I was the publisher of Voice of San Diego for 6 years. As you said, it was the first, strictly digital nonprofit news organization in the country. So it was this grand experiment in 2005. And so we really treated it as an experiment. We just really approached it with a lot of creativity. And we felt like, we had nothing to lose, right? And everything to gain by creating this new nonprofit model. The one thing that we knew had to be at the core of our strategy was a business model that was really, truly sustained and supported by the stakeholders in the community. And I think what we found over time, when we went into it, we were thinking, oh, well, this opens the door for philanthropy, right? We can get local and regional and even national support from foundations and major donors. But what we really found over time is that we had a multitude of different revenue streams at our disposal. And it wasn't just about philanthropy. We obviously started a very robust membership program where for the first time we started talking to residents in San Diego at the time about supporting journalism as a cause. No one was thinking of journalism as a cause, in 2011 and 2012. So it was a very new way of talking, but we also explored advertising and sponsorships and events. And so, we had 4 to 5 different revenue streams. And that's really what allowed us to have the diversity and the staying power to last, all these years. And it was that expertise and that experience that drove me to, spin off from Voice of San Diego and create the News Revenue Hub, because what I was seeing is there was a desire in the space. The Institute for Nonprofit News now has, over 300 newsrooms who want to replicate the success that Voice of San Diego has. But they just needed some added expertise and tools and resources. And so we started working with 5 news organizations in 2016, and now we have over 70 that we're working with, and we've helped them raise over $55 million in volunteer donations that have gone straight into the bank accounts and the budgets at those news organizations. And so I think, honestly, my big takeaway is there's more opportunity for creativity and revenue diversification in the nonprofit model, but it really requires, business savvy people working at these newsrooms, and the ones who are most successful are the ones who are just boldly experimental.
And I think that's absolutely right. And what we've seen in both commercial newsrooms as well as not-for-profit newsrooms are editorial leaders who are as focused as much on delivering great journalism as they are delivering audience and helping ensure that the dollars are coming in the door to help keep that journalism moving forward. So Tracy, I would love to turn to you next. And you were also an early pioneer in starting your own not-for-profit news organization. Tell us about the Pivot Fund, why it is important, and why your approach again, a focus on helping ensure news organizations serving communities of color are sustainable and have what they need. So tell us more about the Pivot Fund and tell us how we can help.
Thanks, Jennifer, for calling me old. I am old. I think,
well, I didn't say
I'm old.
old.
I think it was probably the early to mid, no, it's probably the mid 90s when I launched my very, very first news outlet, and that was a magazine based in Dallas, Texas. And then it was I stumbled on it quite by accident. There was a hair care products mogul who lived in Dallas who pretty much bankrolled us. And then there were some Dallas Cowboys who also gave us revenue to make this a reality. And so I was really, really lucky and fortunate. It wasn't until I launched All Digitocracy when I looked at trying to help journalists understand what was happening in the digital landscape and why we needed to be preparing for this moment where we are now. And I had to kind of raise money on my own. And again, that very lucky, quite by accident, sitting between two donors at dinner one night, I was able to raise the initial seed funding for All Digitocracy. But one of the things that I learned is just how difficult and under-resourced and undercapitalized these hyperlocal news organizations are, and that there were really, you looked around and there was nobody there really. And I think INN was very young. It's just starting out as well. Some of the affinity organizations for publishers, not just publishers of color, but publishers in general, just weren't equipped at that time to support entrepreneurs. And so that's kind of what set all of this in motion, and working with Democracy Fund and then others and trying to create this and build this ecosystem. The Pivot Fund is kind of an outgrowth of all of the experiences that I've had. We are focusing on community-based news organizations led by primarily people of color, for people of color, because that's where I see the most critically underserved communities are in those communities. They're also being targeted with vast amounts of disinformation. So the Pivot Fund seeks out and identifies news outlets that are not on anybody's radar. And we are the seed investor. We de-risk that organization so that, 2 or 3 years down the road, bigger organizations with much deeper pockets will then fund them. So, when I ran REG, one of the organizations that sat at the donor table was the American Journalism Project. And when I should say what REG is the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund at Borealis. So, AJP sat at our donor table. So they were getting our learnings, seeing how to support organizations, how we were supporting organizations around capacity building. And so Pivot Fund is still kind of occupying that space, but we're also adding on supporting outlets beyond just the capacity building and technical support. We're also looking at their newsrooms and looking at their role in the community and how we can better support that and also be a bridge to those community organizations. And finally, we support collaborations, right? Because we understand that there's strength in numbers. And so, that, I guess, those are the 3 big pots, 3 big focus areas for the Pivot Fund. And so I'm happy to talk about that more later, but I want to make sure we get in other folks as well.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And all of your work is just so inspiring. And the Pivot Fund is just one of the most exciting new opportunities that we see out there. So next, I'd love to hear from Sue Cross, who is the Chief Executive Officer and head of the Institute for Not-for-Profit News. Most recently here at the Shorenstein Center, I've had the privilege of working with the Technology and Social Change Project, which has a network of scholars across the world looking at misinformation and disinformation. And one of the things that is just so clear is how important it is for communities and for people to be able to have access to reliable, trusted news and information. And so not-for-profit news organizations around the country, Sue, have just been filling these critical gaps across the country. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about just the skyrocketing growth of INN's membership and how INN is helping these entrepreneurs not only deliver great journalism, but make sure that they're raising the revenue to help support it.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm so happy to be here, and thanks to all of you with this interesting news. We really are looking at good news in news. We don't have to lose our local newsrooms, and we are seeing not just communities, but a lot of civic leaders, business leaders, come to us and to others on this panel and say, okay, what do we do? How can we restore news? How do we reinvent it in our communities? And in many cases, they are forming new outlets that are serving communities that traditional media never really served well. Right now, there are 365 news organizations in this INN network of newsrooms. You know some of the big national names, but what is happening is that we are seeing a growth in local news organizations of something like 20% a year as new ones are founded and formed. And to give you some sense of the scale, these are mostly little small newsrooms. So you think, oh, I don't recognize that brand, but if you put them together, they have more journalists now than NPR and the entire NPR affiliate network. And within 3 years, we see this field doubling, and this will be the biggest shared reporting resource in the country. And I call it that because it is shared, because these are nonprofits. They're not only serving their own communities, they share their news. The average nonprofit newsroom provides reporting to 14 other media outlets. So it's really, we focus on the nonprofits as the most stable and successful model in most communities right now to reinvent news, but they're also lifting this whole ecosystem and helping us through this transition. Some of what we do and the key things where we're really seeing growth and promise is, as Mary said, this is a highly experimental field, and that's a really good thing. We need that. They experiment, they share their experiments. We've seen these small news organizations really lead all media in many ways in uses of mobile to collect news, share news in ways they connect with their communities and start by engaging the community in what their needs are. That's a key to success now. It's not like broadcast journalism where journalists came on screen and said, here's what you need to know. The whole thing starts with asking the community, what do you think you need to know? And then building around that. So it's, when we're asked about nonprofits, they run as businesses. We do a lot of capacity building. We work with partners like News Revenue Hub, the Trust, Trust Project, other things to try to build a new strength across the field. But what we find really defines the nonprofits is not so much just the business model. They have a variety of business models, but that when it's donor-driven news, it enables newsrooms to cover stories, people, communities that have been overlooked by commercial media and that just don't fit a commercial media model. And so you continue to see deep investigative coverage, really deep explanatory coverage of complex topics like environment, climate change, social justice, and so forth. And then you see this collaborative culture that is, I grew up in traditional media, it's profoundly different, and it's changing the economics of news and really extending the impact of the journalism because they are sharing common resources. We're able to work with our members to bring new news or new money in to support journalism from organizations that don't think of themselves as journalism philanthropists. And our members also are collectively building new revenue sources to fund that journalism. So we have had members coming together around forming shared sponsorship networks and underwriting networks. They come together to learn in many ways from each other. They exchange all their business information quite openly every year, all their revenue, all their expense data, and from that they can learn together. And then they collectively fundraise at the end of each year from a really amazing nationwide initiative that Jennifer started. Was her vision to start a thing called News Match, where national funders match local funding of journalism. And that seed funding, that matching lever, is now really transforming local support of news. There's now more local support and partner support coming into these newsrooms through that than there is from the National Seed Fund. So we look for all these levers. How do we grow as a network? How do we grow the whole field? And then push those levers to help each individual newsroom and help them grow as a network.
So I think one thing that's important for everyone to understand, as well as one of the biggest threats right now, are the hundreds, 1,500, 1,800, and growing network of partisan local websites masquerading as local news. So one of the reasons why local journalism is important for our democracy and for our future is at a time when there are very low levels of trust in the national media. We have very high levels of trust in local news. And one of the concerns, of course, is the confusion that's now being created by all of these local websites that are partisan driven, that are not producing journalism. They're producing propaganda and often misinformation, and pretending to be local news. So I think it's really important for people to understand what are the community guidelines that members of the Institute for Not-for-Profit News must meet to be part of this growing network of nonpartisan nonprofit news outlets, independent, and why that's so important.
Thanks, Jennifer. It is becoming more important. INN formed as a consortium of investigative journalists. It was very rare at the time it formed in 2009. And right from the get-go, it said, we need to share values. It's a network of shared values with the aim of building trust with the public and transparency. So it's always held values. All of our members have editorial independence policies that they publish and that they also share with funders, saying, even if you fund us, you don't get to, that doesn't give you the right to determine a story. We only serve the public. We only serve the reader and our communities. They are often advocates for their communities, but they're not advocates for legislation or another cause, and they have to be organizationally independent. And we also ask our members to be transparent about their funding to the public. So it's not just one of those, I don't know who pays for us, I'm pure as a journalist, and I can't be corrupted. It's telling the public, here's who funds our reporting, so they know and they can make a decision of, oh, I'm going to trust this. And many studies are now showing that the more you tell the public about your values as a news operation, your standards, how you operate, the more that trust can be restored or it's there. And we do see that at the local level. It has become more important. It used to be INN check these values, but now we do hear from many organizations that may not be the overt, politically funded, purely out there kind of truly fake news sites. But we do hear a lot from operations that are really cause communications or public relations. They're newsrooms that are an outgrowth of a cause organization or a corporation, they aren't nefarious necessarily, but nor are they portraying to the public what they really are, which is usually they have some other social agenda, as well as just informing the public and empowering the public. So we do see more of that, and these standards have become more important. Our members have asked us to do more. Many of our members carry the INN logo on their site, but the public doesn't really know what that means. And so we're creating materials to say, this is what this stands for. We commit to tell you, the public. And it's that relationship with the public that is, I think, so powerful in nonprofit news, because it's coverage from within a community rather than coming from outside for the most part.
Thank you for that. It's such an important, that clarification is just so important at this time. And Lauren, you're leading the 152-year-old Salt Lake Tribune. And at a time when we have seen hedge funds just decimate major metropolitan daily newspapers across the country, which have long played critical roles, not perfect roles, as we know. Many have created a lot of harm in their communities over the years and have not served all communities, but many have been providing the kind of accountability reporting, the public service journalism, and reliable, trusted news and information for decades. So we're so lucky that in Philadelphia, we have the Lenfest Institute, which has purchased and is behind the transformation of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And we have local ownership here in Boston at the Boston Globe, and in Minnesota, and on Long Island. And tell us, Lauren, how and why the Salt Lake Tribune decided, as part of its transformation, to become a not-for-profit news. And I think it's also really important too for people to hear about the innovative approaches that you took while a leader at McClatchy in bringing philanthropy in to produce great community journalism. But why did the not-for-profit model make sense?
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. So the Tribune was owned by a hedge fund, as some of you may know. A hedge fund named Alden bought the Tribune in 2011. And it did what one would anticipate a hedge fund would do, in that the staff got smaller, right? And we experienced cuts. And there was a local philanthropist in town. His name is Paul Huntsman, who's a businessman, just as many members of his family were, very deeply engaged in seeing Utah be successful. And so he bought the Tribune from Alden in 2016. Family had never owned a newspaper, and decided that he and the family would save it from the hedge fund ownership that was currently under. But leaving Alden wasn't the solution that everyone thought it would be. The Tribune was losing money every month at the time of that purchase. It wasn't because the journalism wasn't good. The Tribune that very year did reporting that in 2017 won a Pulitzer. Some of the factors that impacted other news organizations impacted us, right? We know what the aughts and the teens looked like for local news, but our problems were compounded by a revenue share with another news organization in town, in Salt Lake, that was not equitable due to negotiations that were previously made by the hedge fund. So Paul, who deeply wanted to see the Tribune be successful, knew he needed a different solution. And so he started talking to folks around the state and elsewhere. He knew that he could raise philanthropic support if there was a way for the Tribune to accept it, right? And so the Tribune applied with the IRS to become a nonprofit. Its application was accepted sooner than anyone expected, and the Tribune was off to the races, so to speak, as the first major metro to make the transition from for-profit to nonprofit. Shortly after that transition, that operating agreement dissolved, and that was critical for us because for the first time in more than 60 years, we were able to sell our own product and sell our own advertising. We went from printing 7 days a week to 1. We're now at 2. That was another critical transition for us, right? Shedding some of the legacy costs that comes with operating a printed product, and also culturally making the shift to, okay, what do our audiences need? What do our communities need? And how do we think about that first versus filling this print hole? So since I joined the Tribune as its editor in late 2020, we've transitioned from running a news organization that was consistently in the red to one that is consistently in the black. Roughly 40% of our revenues are subscription related, 40% are advertising related, and 20% come from philanthropic support. And that 20% is huge, right? We would not be in the black if not for the support of the community. I do want to stress here that there are all kinds of solutions, as Sue has said and as Mary has said, right? And there are different models and different people who will make different decisions. But one of the things that we've really tried to emphasize at the Tribune is that the reporting must be relevant. Who are we trying to reach? How can we be intentional so that we make maximum impact? Why would someone read the story? Why would they care? Are we listening to them as we are crafting the quote unquote daily report? The model doesn't matter if the product is not valuable, right? And then as Mary had emphasized, where do we link what we're doing on the journalism side with the business side? And how can we make very direct connections such that we know when we write these kinds of stories, people will support us, right? And so the new long-term North Star for us is sustainability, which for us is profitability. And to be profitable, we must be relevant to those people we seek to serve. And so doing that as a nonprofit is part of the discovery process for us now. Are we practicing active listening? Who are our community partners? What does it mean to be a nonprofit news organization versus a for-profit news organization? We've had, a year plus to make the transition. We feel like we're on good footing, and now we're doing the work of figuring out really what that means, hopefully, right, for the next 150 plus years.
Thank you, Lauren. And the Salt Lake Tribune right now is the first, and at the moment, only major metro that has become a not-for-profit, but we're watching closely to see if this is a trend that we'll see in other markets across the country. Next, I turn to Lillian Ruiz, who is one of the founders and the COO of the National Trust for Local News. And I love that already in the chat, Lillian, people want to know about your other extraordinary expertise in blockchain technology. So can we just go to Bitcoin and to what you learned from the Civil Foundation and have blockchain technology and Bitcoin bail us out of all of this? But first, tell us about the National Trust for Local News, which we were talking about earlier. The work for it began here at the Shorenstein Center, led by Elizabeth Hansen, and would very much love to know, Lillian, about if you could just tell us about the latest work of the Trust, and especially the exciting work that the Trust has been leading in Colorado.
Sure, absolutely. And I feel like I have to preface all this by saying my co-working space has just decided to blast its air conditioning at about 100 in 47-degree weather. So if you see me fidgeting, it's just trying to stave off hypothermia. But just jumping in. Yeah, the National Trust for Local News, we're a pretty new national nonprofit. Our aim is to work with funders and communities to keep local news sustainable and, more importantly, in local hands. We do that by providing community-focused financing and different capital approaches to ensure that the resources critical to powering transformation, succession, long-term sustainability, and ultimately strong community-focused operations exist and are accessible. Ultimately, my co-founders and I, we came together because we saw a really similar need and a similar concern, which is that the US is losing obviously far too many small and mid-sized community newspapers of all types. And these community-focused news organizations, they have long-standing trust and value, yet they're most in danger of sort of being out of the loop on so many of these incredible resources and opportunities that exist. So the National Trust, we are focused on kind of iterating on the answer to our big guiding question, which is how do we mobilize and deploy community-focused financing and patient capital? And how do we take those financing opportunities and capital opportunities and combine them with state level support and partnership? Because those pieces together, the capital approaches and the state level support and partnership are really what are going to build the enduring infrastructure that strengthens community news and preserves local ownership. So our first transaction where we got to test a lot of this out was around this time a year ago in Colorado. We created the Colorado News Conservancy, which is set up as a public benefit corporation. We used it to acquire 24 suburban newspapers in and around the Denver metro area. And, we were really lucky in two really important ways. One was being able to pull in the Colorado Sun as a local operating partner. I had worked with them in the past as they were getting started in 2018. And had a sense that this would be really a good fit with their mission and their strategy and how they viewed the information landscape and the news landscape across Colorado. So that was a huge, luck be a lady factor for us. And then the other is, I think, for those of you in the audience who are already sort of read in on the mediascape, Colorado has an incredibly strong network of partners. The Colorado Media Project, they were there ready to roll up their sleeves and work with us, broker introductions, give us the real sort of lay of the land as to where the pieces were in Colorado and where they were having difficulties, getting certain gaps to close. And because of the Colorado Media Project, there's a huge amount of interest in Colorado from local, statewide, and national funders that had been cultivated over the past 3 years by the Colorado Media Project. So between Colorado Media Project and Collab, there was a level of infrastructure and support that was ready for new opportunities. Ultimately, they were interested in having a strong national collaborator that could come in, build the initial infrastructure and the initial approach, really think about what the financing structure should be and how we could start to create a platform that would, create an open door for a lot of organizations across Colorado. And that's really what we were able to bring to the table, and then use their, incredibly generous understanding of the landscape so that we could build a platform for effectively acquisition and over the long term, shared state level services that works with, and more importantly, for Colorado. And I think that was one of the biggest things that we were able to kind of take away from the Colorado space is, this was a very, very specific set of fortuitous circumstances, but it gave us an understanding of, what we can do when there's a strong partner, and then also where things might be different, where there are just different types of partnerships, different levels of interest, different types of, financing stakeholders, and recognizing that each conservancy is going to be its own special hothouse flower in some ways, but understanding that it's really, as long as we can get that initial understanding of the local partner, the local infrastructure, the local information, and marry that with, our pretty technical, but also spiritual understanding of these spaces, we could really come up with some interesting financial solutions and business solutions and operating solutions that we hope over time will make sure that small publishers or just community publishers in general can invest their time, their energy, their insights in initiatives and not necessarily survival. So that's sort of the overload. the overlay that we've gotten. I could nerd out on any of those, but I'll wait until question and answer.
Well, we're going to get to the Q&A soon. And one of the questions, of course, is about the opportunity of blockchain technology. And so, Lillian, we will turn to you for the answer to that question with your prior leadership and expertise from the Civil Foundation. And next, I'd love to turn to Michelle Sobranovic, who oversees portfolio management at the American Journalism Project, which is a philanthropic venture capital news organization, not-for-profit organization that was founded just a couple of years ago. So Michelle, tell us about the vision of the American Journalism Project. How does it work? And why is it so important right now?
Thanks, Jennifer. So, I joined AJP in its first year coming from public media, and the organization was created recognizing the growing scale of this problem and looking for solutions that would be sustainable in scale. And the big gaps that we saw up front were just the lack of significant upfront, like local seed capital and growth capital for these local news organizations that was preventing them from being able to hire business and revenue and operations staff that they need to grow. So they were doing really impactful reporting. They were able to demonstrate that, but just the money was not there. And they didn't have the talent and capacity in-house to really develop, not only pursue philanthropic revenue and grants, but also diversify their revenue streams and grow their audiences. So that's where we started. We ended up raised, 86 million for local nonprofit news. We deploy that in the form of grants to nonprofit news organizations. We've backed 32 so far. So we make grants, and we also partner we have a startup program that's actually partnering with local philanthropy and communities to launch new organizations as well. To see what if you have the capital up front and you have a strategy up front and you're well resourced up front, what's possible. And our relationship with the organizations, I think, is really special. We're able to coach leaders, and we're not experts on everything. I'm a success partner. That's one of my hats I wear at AJP. And so I have the privilege to work with Outlier and City Bureau and iNewsSource and Wivo Public Media. And these are very different organizations. And I just have so much respect for the local leaders and the work they're doing locally. And we have this unique national perspective, but because of the relationship we have, we're able to be really responsive to what's the need in their market. And sometimes that is like helping them find the right hires and attract talent. And we know with COVID, what kind of market folks are working in, and being able to compete and offer competitive salaries and retain great talent to build a really great culture for your organization so that diverse staff can thrive. And I say diversity, racial, economic, but also people coming from different paths of life, and journalists working with non-journalists, and what does that look like? And we also are able to help them unlock local philanthropic support, and we're kind of doing that together because we want local journalism to be a funding priority nationally and locally, and not just like a passing phase. We want this to be at the same level as support for some of the arts, and for philanthropy to recognize individually and foundations, institutional philanthropy, how important this is. And so we do that together. And I think that based on investments we've made and the relationship we have, like we're proving out what's possible in different markets with very different types of models. If you have that infusion up front and you're able to provide that support, a lot of this work is built on the work that Sue and Mary and others on this call have done. Like INN is a prerequisite for us if we're making a grant to an organization. Like, do you already abide by this? We look for that as part of our due diligence. We're sending people to other resources that are in this field, this growing field that's so amazing and supportive. And then again, just being able to kind of reimagine what this local news landscape could look like from an abundance mindset amidst the scarcity that has existed. So that's in sum what we do. But I think it's been really exciting coming from local to work at a national organization that really has that unique relationship with these organizations, and being able to adapt and learn from each other, right? Like we're learning as much. The work that the organizations we're supporting are doing on the ground is influencing our strategy. It's influencing the way we make investment decisions. It's influencing the way we go and approach starting a new organization. And so I think that is really having that respect for what each party brings to the table is really important. And yeah, it's exciting. And we're, looking forward to being able to make more grants this year, stepping back and learning, and continuing to unlock more local money. Because, as we show, like, when you're able to hire people and you have the resources, the impact that these organizations are able to have, and how quickly they're able to grow. I love the example coming from public media. Sahan Journal was an organization incubated in the Twin Cities out of public radio. And you see this organization focused on serving immigrants and communities of color in the Twin Cities. And they applied public media's membership model directly to a digital only news thing. And Mary, obviously this is like the bread and butter of what you've done. It's like, look what's possible. Now public media, we have 2 public media grantees. It's like, oh, what does it look like for you to have a digital product and reach communities that you're not already serving? And like, there's actually a revenue path there. Like, it just starts to like show what's actually possible. City Bureau is bringing their documenters network to multiple cities, like proving what does that look like, and what does it look like to engage, not just engage your audience and be responsive, but really bring people in the community into this process and to feel part of local news, particularly for communities who've always felt like they were left out or misrepresented. It's it's exciting to see things that, I had a taste of in Detroit. And I've admired people doing this work in other places, and being able to, not just scale specific organizations, but these ideas. And again, back it with evidence that, like, if you make these, you can feel confident. We'll take the risk so that other investors can feel confident joining us and making these types of investments that are sorely needed.
And Michelle, one of the exciting things about having you as a leader at the American Journalism Project is that you bring like years of experience as a former general manager in public radio. And we do have an existing network of great public radio news operations across the country. In Boston, of course, WBUR and WGBH and KQED and KPCC, just producing really important and great journalism for their markets. So one of the really most exciting things about the future is how might these networks in public media and not-for-profit startups come together and really provide the kind of networked future for local journalism that we need. I'm going to go right to the Q&A, and there are, number one, I'm so thankful to our panelists who have been answering many of the questions in the Q&A. And Lillian, everyone is interested, not everyone, but multiple people are interested in the role of and the opportunity of blockchain. So I was wondering if you could take that on for us.
Yeah, sure. Seeing this amount of questions, sort of, I guess like it must be like looking at a middle school picture of yourself with braces on. But with I would say, gosh, there's so many different places you can sort of start with in terms of how to think about blockchain in the journalism space. I think, what a lot of people sort of didn't realize at the time with Civil, and we were extraordinarily early in the blockchain space. We started researching the project in 2016. We started rolling it out in 2017. One of the things that I think we probably could have communicated much more clearly is that, blockchain it's the underlying protocol, but it's not the tool. It's what you build on top of the tool. It's what you use it for. So we were really focused on how can we use this underlying protocol to build licensing tools that make it easier for direct payment between licensor and licensee, thinking about how we could use it for creating more direct and clear relationships between readers and specific journalist, or so almost like a Substack model before there was Substack, how you could use payments on the blockchain to underwrite certain types of work, how you can, for example, give fractional payments to different categories of writing and, be able to underwrite different types of editorial products. Civil was very much an experiment. But ultimately, it was about trying to think about this one particular protocol and all of the various things that you could build on top of it. And I think if we as a field really think about blockchain in that way, as opposed to, blockchain is Bitcoin, or, blockchain is the tool, we start to open up a lot of really interesting spaces and places where we can rebuild or just completely override the things that were built for us on Web 2 that no longer serve us. So it was really about, how could we take this first mover advantage and build something that's actually built for journalists? And I think that's going to continue to be the opportunity of blockchain. I don't think anyone's cracked it, and I don't really think anybody's sort of built a tool on it for news and journalism since, but I think people should continue to experiment on that, on that platform and source. So hopefully that kind of clears that up a little bit. Please host a webinar.
That's super, super, super helpful. So what I'd like to do is please, panelists, go into the Q&A, and if you're able to answer, some of these questions are very, very specific, and your expertise, I think, would be super, super helpful. Tracie, so with the
Yes.
Pivot Fund, tell us why your vision for the Pivot Fund is as focused as much on raising capital as in providing the technology and business expertise that you see needed.
Yes. BIPOC news outlets are historically undercapitalized and under-resourced. And so I know we are talking a lot about sustainability today, and that's great. But I think we often miss a step in the process, and that's stabilization. And so we have to go in there and stabilize a lot of these organizations, including the emerging ones, right? We provide stabilization, we conduct strategy, and then, provide technology and so forth. And then we start trying to identify new streams of revenue in order to, make these organizations sustainable. But a lot of these organizations don't have the capacity. So when we're going in there with training programs, we're really training the founder and publisher, and that's really difficult because they're trying to learn all this new stuff that they need to know to create sustainability. But they got to they got to keep the plane in the air, right? They're flying the plane and then trying to learn all this other stuff that we're providing for them now. I'm glad that we're providing it to them, but we need to add capacity and also make sure we're training the people who we're trying to put into their newsrooms to create sustainability. Because we're just training the publisher and founder of these small independent outlets, it goes oftentimes it's for naught, right? So that's why the Pivot Fund focuses on this stabilization and capacity building piece as the intermediate step to sustainability, and then get them ready for those dollars for that really add the revenue generation piece to it. I hope I answered your question. I wanted to try to get to the question about rural communities too. Is that okay? Because I know we had a couple in there. So I'm really excited about this because I do think that a lot of times when we talk about rural communities, we continue to leave out whole communities that are there. And so one of the things that Pivot Fund has been doing for the past 6 months, and I'll talk about it in broad terms, is, Pivot Fund and Lillian with National Trust, we've been partnering to invest in rural communities. And I'm really, really excited about that. We've been finding some really awesome news outlets and who are really providing critical information and news to their communities in innovative and creative ways. And so I want to just recognize and honor that question or two that I saw in the chat, because things are being done. I think INN has a rural communities program as well. We understand the critical importance of these communities. We understand that they exist in a lot of news deserts. They might have a weekly paper that likely doesn't have a whole lot of local news. And so those issues, all of those issues are being addressed holistically. And I don't know, Lillian, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you sum that up super perfectly, Tracy. You know, with the rural communities, probably the thing that I would add is, you know, for those of us who are sitting on this funding level, taking a lot of, I think what Tracy brings to the Pivot Fund, which is a lot of like humility and learning, and that we need to bring that as we work in these spaces, because there is so much, there are so many insights that like we can't possibly have from the national perspective. So how do we cultivate that? And how do we have the strategies as organizations to cultivate that learning so that, you know, we can really be, when we are on the ground, we can be true partners and we can really be supportive and be responsive, and not necessarily, you know, other playing in other spaces. So I think that would be the only thing that I would add to, you know, what the work, there's the work that exists and the work that we all probably need to continue to develop and work on.
So we have thank you, Lillian. Thank you, Tracy. So we have a question in the chat about philanthropic support for for-profit organizations. And Lauren, before joining the Salt Lake Tribune, you worked at McClatchy, which owns and operates newspapers across the country. And really, McClatchy was a pioneer in this area in getting philanthropic support for community focused journalism. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that. And I know that we're almost at time at 10 o'clock, but dear audience, our panelists have agreed to stay a little bit beyond the 10 a.m. The 10 a.m. I'm on Pacific time, the 1 p.m. Hour to keep the conversation. But first, if Lauren, you could tell us about the work that you did with McClatchy, which was led at that time by another fellow, Shorenstein Center fellow, Craig Foreman.
Sure, yes, thank you. So McClatchy at the time was family owned, and it was pressured by a lot of debt, right? From buying another media company. Some of you may be familiar with that purchase of Knight Ridder, right? And so anything that was incoming was going to try to service that debt to keep McClatchy out of bankruptcy, which ultimately didn't work, but that's fine. For the purposes of this conversation, I should say. So anyhow, we didn't have a lot of resources, right? We just didn't have that reporter to go do that thing that the community wanted us to do, right? And many McClatchy newsrooms at the time were committed to listening to their communities and understanding where the needs were. And so we started having conversations with community foundations, with other nonprofits in town, with local business leaders. And, you know, we asked them if they would support local news. And there were a lot of difficult conversations around, well, how do we know that money's not going to pay off your debt, right? How do we know that money is going to do what you say it will do, right? And there was a lot of education that we had to do around, okay, yes, we understand that you understand what our business model is. We feel that, but does that mean that community X, Y, or Z is less deserving of local news or information, right? And many of the people that we talked to were open to supporting local reporting. It was a very transparent process. The money did not sit with McClatchy. It sat at community foundations who then directly paid reporters for the work that they were doing. And we were able to launch more than a handful of labs. So we launched an education lab in Fresno, an equity lab, in Sacramento. We launched a lab in Kansas City. And we found funding for reporting across the country, because there were people in local communities who cared enough about the future of those communities to invest in local reporting, even though they were investing via a for-profit news organization.
Thank you. And we have a question too from Nick Nyan, just in terms of priorities. I mean, what we're seeing, of course, is that it really varies market by market. But what are the priorities for revenue generation, and what are the most effective strategies? Is it membership, subscriptions, events? And how do leaders decide what is the most promising revenue generating strategy for their organization? Is that something maybe Sue, Michelle, you want to jump in and help us?
Unmuting, sorry. Yes, the mix of revenue does vary a lot by community. It varies by the size of the community, the wealth of the community. We see differences. Some places in the East Coast, you have a wealth of old family foundations and civic funders. In Sunbelt areas, they may have fewer of those. So it does vary a lot, but we see some clear trends. If you're talking about local media, foundation funding, grant funding is typically half or a little under, and individual revenue is just steadily growing, not in leaps and bounds, but steadily increasing. It can be up from a third to 40% typically. And then in local news, they also have a really healthy earned revenue opportunity, often from local sponsorship ads, sometimes from tickets for events, and those seem to have carried over to virtual events. So that's kind of the typical mix for local media. If you're looking at something that is by single subject or national, we do have breakdowns. If you go to the research tab on inn.org, you can dive in and see what the typical revenue mix is for different types of publications. If you're starting out, the thing I would just say is fundraise up front. Don't be shy about it. Don't think I have to work as a journalist for free for 6 months before I can ask anyone for money. Go out and talk to your community and find some supporters, whether they're funders or individuals who might invest in you. That gets you off to a good start.
And Michelle, what approaches are you seeing most effective? And also, of course, you can't generate revenue for your journalism if you're not building your audience. And so where are you seeing tractable results there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it really, when we look at what the revenue potential is for each organization and what's like the most viable strategy to pursue, at least, what the assumptions we're making up front or the track record they have to date, it really depends on their model. It depends on their market, as Sue was saying. And I think I see Lillian's comment here too, like really understanding what that community needs, having a really strong value proposition is gonna be critical for any revenue, whether that's being able to grow your audience based on having a clear value proposition and products to offer, and then that they'd want to support and being consistent, being able to make a strong case to support. That's going to enable you to also get support from foundations. They want to see that you're actually reaching people and having an impact, and that you understand the impact of your work. And then obviously it matters for earned revenue if you're pursuing sponsorship. And we've seen, like, I'll just throw Sahan in again, they're pursuing all of those things at once. They were able to get a lot of upfront, they were incubated with NPR. They had a lot of upfront grant funding nationally. They were able to unlock local philanthropy. They're also in the Twin Cities, which philanthropically speaking, there was, some ground had been paved there, and they were in a market where that was possible. But they've also had significant growth with membership based on having a really unique value proposition and meeting a unique need in that community really well. And they've grown their membership revenue. They have a sustaining membership program, and they have a sales sponsorship package, and they're able to sell because they're saying, look, we're reaching a really unique audience, and like they value this work. It comes from, when you look at public media's revenue model, like in general, it's pretty similar pie, but I think if you're doing investigative, it might look different. We see there's a lot of opportunity, and I know INN has been doing a lot with major gifts. Public media as well, so has huge untapped major giving potential. It helps to have a pipeline of people who've been supporting you up front, but you also have to be unafraid to, tap your networks. If you're building a board or advisory board, who do you know that can connect you? And we see people even in our portfolio connecting to each other. Like, oh, do you have a connection to this funder? Or is there anyone that has a relationship to this place that I'm operating, or cares about this issue that I can talk to, and pitch the work. People generally, like, when you start asking, you're clear about your ask, and you're clear about the value you're offering and what's unique about that, we've seen people just stepping and wanting to provide that support. That doesn't mean it's easy. I don't advise like try all the revenue streams all at the same time. Prioritize your hires accordingly and adapt as needed. But I think there's tons of opportunity for more membership growth as organizations are just reaching new audiences and bringing new people to local news. I think that's going to enable far more major giving. It's going to be a driver for earned revenue. Some organizations are going to continue to do well with philanthropy, institutional philanthropy, because of the market they're in. Others, that's going to be a challenge, and we see them relying more on national philanthropy to subsidize them until they can get these other balls rolling in their market. So again, it's not one size fits all. Obviously, again, you want to be able to invest your staff where you see a clear path and not try to invest, kind of semi-invest in a bunch of things all at once and spread yourself too thin. And to Tracy's point, especially early on, like there's tons of training out there. There's lots of opportunities to learn, but like if you're founding an organization, there's just one of you or you have a small team, you just have to prioritize and get clear on what you're going to focus on to start, and ask around, like do that research, talk to people, talk to peers in similar markets who are trying to do something similar to you. I think that in general, the nonprofit news and nonprofit and extended local news has been really generous. We see it again within the portfolio we support, just really generous with sharing their successes and failures and what's working. And I think that, maybe I'm a little biased, especially with this beautiful panel of women, but seeing a change in the leadership and who's stepping up in leadership roles at these organizations and their willingness to work together differently and learn together faster and just operate differently than the media has traditionally operated at a local and national level, I think is really exciting.
Thank you so much, Michelle. So we have one last question, and I put in my contact information. If people have additional questions, or if you would like to learn how you might get involved in helping support and deliver the solutions to this crisis in local journalism. So we have a question from David Clinch, the founder of Storyful, a pioneer in how to use social media for reporting, and who is now with Mather, which is a really important organization that's been around for several years now, helping publishers generate revenue. And David's question is around data science and how is data science used to help build audience. I mean, we all know that if you don't understand your audience, if you don't understand the data, it's going to be very difficult to create that funnel. So who would like to take on that question about analytics and data science?
I'm happy to.
Thank you, Lillian.
Yeah. So I think one of the first things is, it's interesting that you use the phrase data science and not analytics when we're talking about this. Like, part of the challenge is like right sizing the information in order to act on it. So, when we talk about like what role does data science and analytics play, I think it really, especially when we think about small news organizations, it's really about how do we help them harness the most basic information just to get them to the next phase. If you're not a massive organization, the analysis paralysis is a real thing. So, what are your revenue drivers? How do you identify them? How do you measure them? What's your impact? What's your audience look like when you do an impactful story? That's probably about it to start with in some places. And I think as organizations grow, or more importantly, as they collaborate or network, that's when we can really think about data science as playing like a large role. But data science for data science sake is not really my ministry, but I'm happy to hear pushback on that.
And your background before civil, of course, was in building audience and really using the data to help inform it. Is there any difference in building in using data science in the not-for-profit space than in the commercial space?
I think the biggest difference is really along that impact measurement component and how much that question is shifting in our space. So how we're seeing the importance of certain types of civic involvement or economic change and so on, and really fine tuning what those measurements are so we can actually measure to them, which I think is really interesting. And I think for-profits should be looking at those same measurements as well. So once somebody gets them right, hopefully we all can.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. And it's just been so inspiring just to hear from the leaders of so many different organizations around the country that are supporting trusted, credible news and information and journalism in the public interest. I mean, one of the most important things that I learned from all of you is just because you're a not-for-profit organization, that certainly doesn't mean that that revenue and earned revenue and audience and business and having the right technology to serve your audience is key. So thank you again, all of you in the audience for joining us. And I'd like you to know that on April 7th, the next event in the series will be hosted by my fellow Shorenstein Center fellow, Craig Foreman, who's the former president of McClatchy. And you'll hear during that session from leaders who are really pioneers in how they're engaging with audiences in their communities. So thank you everyone for joining us, and please check out the Shorenstein Center website. There's all sorts of exciting events and news coming up, including the Goldsmith Awards. Thank you again, all of you here, for all that you do.
Everybody.